Bos taurus and Bos taurus indicus, which is the officially correct way to refer to these as different subspecies within Bos taurus. At one time were even considered separate species, Bos taurus and Bos indicus, and so that's how I'm going to talk about them today. But they have a common ancestor. They were domesticated from oryx, which is Bos taurus primigenius, and these are ancient species. They're now extinct. They actually went extinct here just in the last 1,000 years. But here's some cave paintings in southern France that really depict these creatures. I always wonder whether she had some ringworm or something because of the specks around the eye, but nevertheless, these were animals that were hunted, and they were culturally important just from that standpoint before cattle were ever domesticated. And Bos taurus cattle were domesticated from these animals up here in this region of modern-day Turkey. And if we zoom in a little bit on that, I want you to notice there's the Taurus Mountains and the Anti-Taurus Mountains, so obviously kind of similar name. And this is an area that we call the Fertile Crescent, here between the Tigris and Euphrates River. And it's really in this region that Bos taurus cattle were domesticated, right? So this is a Mediterranean climate surrounded by some mountains. Bos indicus cattle, which were domesticated a few thousand years later, about 7,000 BC, were primarily domesticated in the Indus Valley region here around modern-day Pakistan. So this is the Indus River Valley. And you can see this is much lower elevation, and it's flanked by a desert here, the Thar Desert. So pretty different geographical areas for cattle to have been domesticated in, and these are separate domestication events. The other thing to point out is the Tropic of Cancer runs right here. So we're talking about a subtropical to even tropical environment in which Bos indicus cattle were domesticated. So I think it's pretty reasonable then to expect that there are some differences between these cattle because they, again, were domesticated at different times in different areas from different portions of these wild oryx. So I want to talk about, are they really all that different in functional ways relative to reproductive management, ways that maybe we can do things differently to accommodate. So the first area of real difference between Bos indicus influenced animals and Bos taurus animals is in the age at puberty. And so puberty is important for beef cattle, whether we're talking about Bos taurus or Bos indicus, because we know that heifers that become pregnant earlier in the breeding season, they remain in the herd longer as cows. So they have a longer productive lifespan, and they also wean more pounds of calf over their lifetime. So they're just more profitable animals. Purebred Bos indicus heifers raised in the tropics and subtropics, and those production systems often reach puberty at really dramatically late ages, 16 to 40 months of age. And you might say, well, we're not talking in the United States about purebred Bos indicus cattle for the most part. We're talking about crossbred percentage Bos indicus cattle. And so what is the typical age of puberty attainment for that biological type? And really more in our production systems, which are not straight tropical, but maybe bordering on subtropical, and even in potentially the more arid Southwest. So certainly it's pretty clear from the data across all of the publications in Bos indicus influenced animals that age at puberty is later in Bos indicus cattle, Bos indicus influenced cattle, I should say, than it is in straight-bred Bos taurus cattle. But even in the 50s and 60s, it was really well established that it was still early enough that management to calve at 2 years of age was still possible. And so this age at puberty is not necessarily an excuse to push this biological type towards calving at 3. Certainly possible to have calving at 2. So when I say possible, I want to talk about what really makes that possible. So certainly when we think about managing for age at puberty, nutrition is probably first and foremost in our mind. And I always try to point out that nutrition doesn't in and of itself cause puberty. It's permissive of puberty, right? So you have to have some underlying genetic potential for earlier puberty in order for nutrition to allow that. But if you don't adequately provide nutrition, you also can't kind of unlock the genetic potential for early puberty. And so one tool that's already been talked about a little bit today is this concept of target weight, which is managing heifers to be some percentage of a mature cow's weight at the beginning of their breeding season. And so a common recommendation, this has been mentioned already, is 65%. There's some debate in Bos Taurus heifers now about whether we can use a lighter target weight of 55% and still achieve fairly strong reproductive performance, and what some potential advantages might be from the standpoint of labor inputs. But in Bos indicus cattle, I'm going to show you a little bit of data as to why we really ought to stick to this higher development weight. So, and some data that Dave Patterson, who spoke earlier, collected in the late 80s and early 1990s. He looked at management of heifers to either a 55% in the black bars or a 65% target weight. And you can see that in these European breeds of Bos Taurus cattle, fairly similar performance regardless of the target weight used, but those Brahman influenced animals were really sensitive to these lower development target weights. And so this higher development this higher percentage target weight is really a risk management strategy in terms of development of Bos indicus influenced females. So in terms of a target weight and selecting a 65% of a target weight, you really need to think about whether the target weight that you have in mind is actually an accurate target rate, right? So I know that we're kind of in desert elk hunting country, and so I imagine I have a few bow hunters in the room, and this is what the sight on a modern compound bow would look like. Looking down the aperture, there's different pins, and those correspond to essentially different ranges, right? And so I might have a pin for 40 yards, and I might have a pin for 20 yards. I can aim as precisely as possible and have the best, firmest, best technique and keep my bolt very still and use perfect technique. And if I use the 20-yard pin on a 60-yard shot, it doesn't matter how good my form was, I'm going to miss the mark. And likewise with target weight, you really need to have an accurate estimate of what the weight of the mature cows is. And so think about either obtaining actual weights on mature cows by weighing cows or weighing a subset of those cows. Or if you do have to estimate the weight of cows, certainly many of you are going to have some cold cow weights from the time that you sell cold calves. So cold cows, adjust those for body condition score. So if you're selling cold cows that are on the thinner side, maybe a body condition score 4, adjust that up, and one condition score is about 80 pounds. So think about that as you think about a target weight and try to have a very accurate idea, a realistic idea of what the actual weight of those mature Bos indicus cows is. The other tool in the toolbox in terms of development of Bos indicus influenced heifers and heifers in general is certainly reproductive tract scoring. It's already been talked about today, this 1 to 5 scale, where 1, animals are prepubertal with an infantile tract, 2, being prepubertal with a tract greater than 30 days from, indicating greater than 30 days from puberty, peripubertal being within 30 days, the tract score 3, and then tract scores 4 and 5 being cyclic, just in different phases of the estrus cycle. And we know that reproductive tract score is repeatable and it's accurate, and a lot of data collected in Bos Taurus animals, it's been an effective indicator of pregnancy rates to time to eye, of pregnancy rates by the end of the breeding season, and also weaning weight of calves, right? And so it's very informative in terms of what you can draw out of that data. This is some data that we collected in specifically Bos indicus influenced cattle in a fairly large project that was conducted in collaboration with the University of Florida and with the Deseret Ranch. And this is data from heifers on the 14-day cedar protocol, and I want to compare it just to field data that we collected through our Show Me Select replacement heifer program in the state of Missouri. So this is producer data. This is not from a controlled research trial, but it's backed up by really thousands of records. And so I think it gives us a pretty good indicator of how this protocol is functioning in the field. And so I want to highlight a couple things. If you just look within each of these tract score categories between these Bos indicus influenced heifers that were on this research project and the Bos Taurus heifers in Show Me Select, very similar performance within each of these respective tract score categories, right? The challenge, though, is that in Bos indicus influenced females, often you observe very high proportions of these females that are in the lower tract score range, right? But the protocol seems to function pretty effectively in both biological types when you consider those differences in tract score. So the kind of information that you can obtain and and really get a sense of whether those heifers are ready to undergo estrus synchronization. That's really valuable information with reproductive tract scoring. So a common recommendation that we use in Bos Taurus heifers is that over 50% of the heifers should be pubertal prior to the start of estrus synchronization. You can see just if you look at the numbers of animals in these lower tract score ranges, that was not the case here, and that's part of why we had somewhat lower pregnancy rates in those Bos indicus-influenced animals. But certainly managing heifers to have higher rates of puberty at the start of the breeding season is going to result in more success in Bos indicus. So the long-term solution, though, is genetics, right? So whether we're talking about target weights or whether we're talking about reproductive tract score, we're trying to manage what we currently have. But certainly we can improve age of puberty in Bos indicus, similar to what has been accomplished in a lot of Bos Taurus breeds, especially a lot of the continental breeds. And we know that selection pressure historically in Bos indicus animals has been a little bit lower for these reproductive traits. But the heritability estimates for those traits really suggest that we can make a lot of progress in this area if we put selection pressure in place. So think about the kind of selection pressure that you're placing on reproduction as you keep back replacement heifers. And for example, are you trying to select only those heifers that became pregnant during the first portion of their breeding season? Are you retaining only, for example, heifers out of calves that became pregnant during the first portion of the breeding season? What kind of long-term pressure you can place? There are other opportunities as well, right? Using genomic technologies to try to get some genomic predictions about reproductive traits. And so think about all of the tools in your toolbox as you try to manage genetics as well as some of what we talk about on the reproductive side. So in addition to these age at puberty differences, there are also some differences just in terms of general reproductive function in these Bos indicus versus Bos Taurus animals. And I'm going to highlight a few just briefly, one being anestrus, two being ovarian follicular development. I'll touch a little bit on stress, and Dr. Cliff Lamb's going to talk more about that here shortly, and also estrus response. So Bos indicus-influenced cows are probably likely to have higher rates of anestrus, so a higher proportion of them to not be having normal estrus cycles at the start of the breeding season. And there's several potential causes. Really historically, it had often been talked about as Bos indicus-influenced cows having longer length anestrus periods, and there's really not a lot of data to support that, but there is a lot of data to support that, right, there are long-term effects of retaining later maturing, later conceiving heifers, and so that can play into that from a management standpoint. We also know that Bos indicus-influenced cattle are a little bit sensitive to changing planes of nutrition, perhaps a little bit more so than Bos Taurus. And you can kind of think about that really as an evolutionary adaptation, right? That they're able to shut down reproductive function and to avoid getting pregnant when the environment would not permit that. But obviously in our modern systems that can be a little bit of a challenge. There's also a lot of older literature that really shows that Bos indicus cattle behave a little bit more as seasonal breeders, and they do shut down in terms of cyclicity with reducing day length. In addition, gestation length in general for Bos indicus cattle is longer than in Bos Taurus cattle. So for each of these individual criteria, there may or may not be a large impact, but when you start thinking about all of them together, I think it's certainly possible that we're going to have slightly higher rates of anestrus in Bos indicus-influenced cows at the start of the breeding season. And in addition, it's a little bit unclear whether the GnRH products that we use in a lot of our short-term estrus synchronization protocols are as effective in Bos indicus-influenced cattle as they are in Bos Taurus cattle in terms of synchronizing ovarian follicular development. It's a little bit unclear as to why that is, but certainly one reason that has been proposed is that these Bos indicus cows release less LH in response to GnRH or in response to estradiol, and so that may play a role. But certainly the short-term protocols that are really reliant on GnRH to synchronize the follicular wave, it appears that Bos indicus cattle are a little bit less responsive to that product. And also in terms of ovarian follicular development, it appears that Bos indicus cattle are a little bit more sensitive to effects of progesterone and the effect of progesterone on limiting follicular development. And the way that that works is that high progesterone really sort of impacts gonadotropin pulsatility, and that gonadotropin support is really critical for follicular development and ultimately for that follicle to have the capacity to ovulate. And so if these Boston indicus-influenced cattle are more sensitive to that progesterone, then they functionally then have a smaller follicle size and less mature follicles at maybe some of these key time points. And this has really been a topic of interest in the field of synchronization of Boston indicus-influenced cattle in the last decade, with a lot of research really looking at how we can lower circulating concentrations of progesterone or lower the amount of progesterone that's administered to Boston indicus-influenced animals during the course of synchronization. So I'll talk a little bit more in detail about that when I share some specific protocols for these animals. Again, Cliff Lamb is going to talk a little bit more in detail about management of stress, but certainly when we think about Boston indicus-influenced cattle, we think about a biological type that is maybe a little bit more prone to stress from animal handling. And obviously that's a general rule. You may have some Brahmin-influenced females that you think are puppy dogs, and that may well be the case. I've certainly been around some. But generally, these animals are more prone to stress induced by handling. And so we know that handling kind of stress can negatively impact reproductive performance. And so think about, as you manage Boston indicus-influenced heifers and cows, really trying to place a lot of priority on low stress handling. A lot of that may be mediated by cortisol, which is the hormone that we really sort of most commonly associate with the stress response. And we know that has a suppressive effect on LH pulsatility, and again, that can impact reproductive performance. In terms of managing stress, again, think about just general low stress handling and some of the benefits associated with that for this type of heifer or cow, but also acclimating heifers to human contact and human handling appears to have some benefits long term. So Ronaldo Cook has some data in which he showed that acclimating heifers through sort of an acclimation regimen actually improved their temperament scores, reduced their cortisol, their long-term cortisol secretion, also hastened the age of puberty and enhanced actual pregnancy attainment. In addition, also think about the genetics, right? So temperament is moderately to highly heritable, and so that's a trait that you really can make progress in if you put some selection pressure on that trait. Another challenge in Boston indicus-influenced cattle, which is certainly a challenge in Bos taurus as well, but more so in Boston indicus, is detecting estrus accurately. It's just a little bit more difficult in Boston indicus-influenced cattle for a number of reasons. One is that the length of standing estrus in Boston indicus-influenced cattle is shorter than in Bos taurus. And you've already seen some of this data that Dr. Perry presented in terms of timing of estrus expression, and he talked about some of the consequences of that variation in timing of estrus expression that can really impact success if you use a program that's based on estrus detection. And in this case, Boston indicus-influenced animals appear to be a little bit more likely to express estrus at night. In this particular study, there was a proportion of those animals that only expressed estrus at night. And so that's certainly a challenge from the standpoint of managing these females. One thing we can obviously do about that is think about a timed AI protocol that takes estrus detection out of the mix entirely. Another opportunity, and they're not mutually exclusive, of course, is to use some form of an estrus detection aid, like an Estrotech patch. Estrotech has a booth out in the trade show. But this is a patch that allows you to really get an accurate idea about the estrus status of a female based on the amount of coating that's removed off of that patch. So I hope I've convinced you just in the last few slides that they really are different, Boston indicus cattle compared to Bos taurus cattle, even our Boston indicus influenced animals. And so I want to talk now about what we can actually do differently in terms of managing them from a reproductive standpoint. And I'm really only going to focus on estrus synchronization, particularly prior to fixed time AI, because that's really the platform that a lot of these reproductive technologies come through. So first, what can we not do? We can't use estradiol in the United States. Okay, so it's not legally available for estrus synchronization in the United States. There are no estradiol products that are legally available in the United States for use in estrus synchronization. So FDA has not approved any estradiol product for that purpose, and that doesn't mean that you just get to use it quote-unquote off-label, because that's not how the law works, and FDA has really clarified that multiple times, warning veterinarians and warning pharmacies that they cannot compound an estradiol product that gets used in synchronization. So again, they do regard that as illegal, and we can't do that. And so it's really the position of the Beef Reproductive Task Force to heavily discourage use of estradiol in the United States, given that it's perceived to be a carcinogen risk, and there's a lot of potential for that to really be a negative. Let me say it this way, to give our industry a real black eye if some producers were highlighted as using estradiol and that were to, for example, get into popular press. So it's also unlikely that a pharmaceutical manufacturer is going to come out with an estradiol product in the near future, and that's for a couple of reasons. One is that the regulatory attitude towards the use of steroid hormones just makes it a little bit higher burden to get a product like that through. And it's also, as with any animal product, it's costly to do that kind of research, and there's limited market potential for that product. So, unfortunately, the vast majority of estrus synchronization research in Bos indicus cattle right now is coming out of South America. And in South America, they're able to use a lot of estradiol products that we can't use in the United States. And so that means that estrus synchronization options for U.S. producers are a little bit limited in terms of synchronization for Bos indicus-influenced animals. So these are the protocol sheets. We used the same sheets in 2017 and 2018, and then continuing forward in 2019, this is how they're going to look as well. So heifers here on the left and cow protocols here on the right. These are really our options for both Bos taurus and Bos indicus-influenced animals, and so I'm going to walk through some of those. So currently there's only one synchronization protocol that the Beef Reproduction Task Force specifically recommends for Bos indicus-influenced mature cows, and that's the PG 5-day co-sync plus cedar. That's how it's listed on the protocol sheets. If you're from the South, you probably are more likely to hear it referred to as B-Sync, and this was developed by Gary Williams' group at Texas A&M, and it was developed at the research station in Beeville, hence the name B-Sync. So this protocol, again, is here on the cow sheet. I'm going to pull it up a little bit larger so we can all see it. This is the B-Sync protocol, or the PG 5-day co-sync plus cedar protocol. It's very similar to a typical 5-day co-sync plus cedar protocol, which has already been discussed by Dave Patterson earlier in synchronization options for mature cows. But there are a couple differences. One is that prostaglandin is administered at the start of the protocol. And this is intended to reduce circulating concentrations of progesterone. Because again, we know that those high concentrations of progesterone really limit follicular development in Bos indicus-influenced cattle. So that's the intent of administering that product, and that ends up altering a little bit the ultimate timing of estrus expression, so that the timing at which artificial insemination is performed is slightly different for this protocol compared to a typical 5-day protocol. So that's currently the only option that we really have for synchronization of Bos indicus-influenced cows. It's really specifically tailored to that type of animal. Just as a side note, and I talk a little bit more in detail about this in the proceedings, there's a little bit of a question as to whether this GnRH product is going to remain in this specific protocol long term, again, because of questions about how the response rate of Bos indicus to GnRH is a little bit poor. And so it's possible that at some point that GnRH product will be removed from the protocol, but a lot of that research is ongoing. And so the way it's listed in the protocol sheets now and the way that we would suggest to you to use it still involves that GnRH on day 0. So in terms of heifers, unfortunately, currently there's no specific protocol that is specifically tailored to Bos indicus-influenced heifers that the Beef Reproduction Task Force specifically recommends for that type of heifer. So what we have for heifers here on the left side, I'll blow these up, is 2 short-term protocols and 2 long-term protocols. The 7-day co-sync plus cedar and the 5-day co-sync plus cedar being the short-term protocols. I do want to mention, pay attention to the timing of artificial insemination if you use these protocols in heifers, because it is a little bit different than in cows. And then also the long-term protocols, which involve treatment with a progestin, either cedar or MGA, for a period of 14 days, and then a period of time in which there's no treatment, and then ultimately administration of prostaglandin and time day I after that. So I'm going to talk about some of the data for these protocols in Bos indicus-influenced heifers. So the short-term protocols, the 7-day coasting plus cedar and the 5-day coasting plus cedar, have been evaluated in Bos indicus-influenced heifers with somewhat mixed results. And so we have some researchers that really claim fairly poor performance of these protocols in Bos indicus-influenced animals. We have a fairly recent report in which there was very good performance of this protocol, both of these protocols in percentage Bos indicus heifers. A little bit higher rates of cyclicity prior to synchronization in that particular publication. And one thing that we do know, even in Bos taurus heifers, is that when we have higher rates of cyclicity, those short-term protocols tend to work fairly well, but it's when we really have populations of heifers, or groups of heifers, I should say, that have lower cyclicity proportions, and that's potentially an area in which the longer-term protocols really excel. So I want to show you some of that data. Dave Patterson already showed some of this data, but in field data from our Show Me Select replacement heifer program, we really see consistent results with the 14-day cedar in heifers with mixed cyclicity status, and those protocols I showed you earlier appear to function pretty similarly in Bos indicus and Bos taurus heifers. So just to compare the protocols again used in Show Me Select, we see very consistent performance in this 14-day cedar protocol. Still higher performance in those heifers that are cyclic as opposed to non-cyclic, but really an advantage, especially in these non-cyclic animals, to use of that 14-day cedar protocol compared to the 7-day cedar protocol. So this is a little bit of a University of Missouri bias. I'll be pretty straightforward about that, but we really are pretty strong advocates for the long-term protocols and heifers, and that would be my recommendation to you moving forward in Bos indicus-influenced heifers as well, because of that consideration about cyclicity and having a higher proportion of heifers that maybe are not cyclic prior to treatment. I do want to show you some data using these long-term protocols, specifically in Bos indicus-influenced animals, and this was conducted in collaboration with the University of Florida and with Deseret Ranch. This is some work from Cameron Locke's master's thesis project. And so this is about 1,450 heifers of Bos indicus-influenced, about an 1/8 to 3/8 Brahman. You can see the age there, 12 to 15 months, so certainly a little bit young, and we're going to run into some cyclicity issues, and I'll show you that as well. So we looked at a 14-day cedar PG protocol with fixed time AI, the MGA PG protocol with fixed time AI, and then we also looked at 2 natural service options using long-term progestin treatment as well. So if you are interested in using a long-term progestin and only using that with natural service, my suggestion to you would be don't administer prostaglandin, just allow that estrus to occur in a more spread out way, and that really maximizes your bull power. So turn bulls in about 10 days after cedar removal, so you miss that subfertile estrus that occurs after cedar removal, but those bulls are there well in advance of the synchronized estrus, which occurs out here. Very similar approach with MGA, feeding of MGA for 14 days and then introduction of bulls 10 days after withdrawal of MGA from the feed. So just to highlight, we have those 4 treatments at the top, MGA with natural service, cedar with natural service, and then the 2 time AI protocols. And then we have pre-pubertal animals, so tract scores 1 and 2, peripubertal tract scores 3, and then pubertal animals, which are 4s and 5s. So across all of those animals, regardless of puberty status, we do have pretty good performance of these protocols in Bos indicus-influenced animals in this data set. So certainly these long-term protocols do work. The challenge, though, that I want to highlight is, especially when using timed AI, the more pre-pubertal heifers that you have in that group, that the lower your performance to timed AI is going to be. And so we have lower performance in those timed AI treatments. In contrast, though, those pubertal animals really do quite well. And so again, managing those heifers to have high rates of cyclicity before the start of the breeding season is really critical. So just in conclusion, I think I'm mostly on time. I might have gotten a couple minutes long, I apologize. But Bos indicus-influenced females really are different. They're different in terms of age at puberty, in response to estrus synchronization programs, and we have a limited number of options for estrus synchronization of Bos indicus-influenced females, unfortunately. But the options that we do have are still effective. So this is not an excuse necessarily to not use these profitable technologies if you do have Bos indicus-influenced animals. And it's also likely that in the near future we're going to see more options continue to develop. So certainly want to acknowledge everybody that played a part in some of the research I shared today, and I hope that sets the stage for some more in-depth conversation that we'll have from future speakers. So thank you very much. you.